I go ahead and start in the main room here?
Yes, please. Thank you.
Okay. Such an honor to be with everyone here. It feels so necessary and just a tiny scratch of the surface. I want to share one idea that I'm exploring that has been sitting with me. In some ways it feels trivial compared to some of the work that we've heard about already, that's much more interpersonal. But I do think that one piece of this moment is having a more expansive sense of where God can be and is in these moments. And I want to say from the outset, we know that pregnancy termination can mean so many different things. It can be something people deliberately choose. It can be something that happens that people didn't want. It can be something that people have to think about when they don't want to think about it. It can be something that people just want to get over with and get back to their life and really not spend any time thinking about any religious significance of it and just do what they need to do for healthcare. So I name all of that. And I think when I approach Jewish texts, some of the questions that I have right now are, how can that kind of range of experience be something that is brought to Torah and be something that Torah and our Jewish tradition can honor? So I am going to share an idea that kind of emerges in a few different places in the textual tradition. And I think that in the subtlety of how it appears in different sources kind of speaks to different experiences around abortion and pregnancy loss as well. So I am going to share my screen, and I invite you, if you would prefer, to download the source sheet yourself, which I think a moderator has access to here. And we'll have a brief textual journey, and I'm so curious to hear your responses. So the main thing that I want to lead with here is, what if instead of God being some symbol of knowing what is right or wrong and kind of pointing a finger at somebody who is choosing to have an abortion, has to have an abortion, what if we could relate to God who knows what it's like to have an abortion? And I invite you, even just now in the chat, if you have any immediate thought or question on this idea of maybe God knows what it's like to have an abortion, to just share, what does that title even bring up for you? And you can keep that coming in the chat as we go through the initial source here. Okay. So the first place that we find this idea is just in the very beginning of the creation story. A line that we maybe don't think twice about, which is that after that first day of creation, the text says, "It was evening and it was morning." Vayhi Erev, Vayhi Boker. It was evening and it was morning, that very first day. And the rabbinic eye picks up on the fact that God doesn't create the evening here. It doesn't say, "Let it be evening." Rather, the text says, "It was evening," which implies that evening was something that already existed in the world. It wasn't created right now. This creation of the world is happening on the backdrop of there already having been an evening. And so the Midrash here, the rabbinic eye, reading the text, says, from here we know that there was already the rhythm of time beforehand. The rhythm of time preceded the creation of the world. This may not seem so significant, but when I see this, I think what it teaches us is any moment or fact of creation has a backstory. The story doesn't start with the birth of the world. The story starts before that. There's an evening before that. And I think we can sort of take this in on an individual level when we encounter people who exist, who are born. There's a moment of birth, just knowing there could be a backstory here. It might be kind of dim and murky, and it might never even emerge in full view, but there might be backstories behind the creation of life. And I think we can sort of take that in on an individual level, but potentially also on a wider scale. Just the fact that there is life at all comes on the backdrop of an evening of stories that we don't fully know. Then we get a more explicit statement about this, or what was happening before this world was created. If there was already this rhythm of time, what was happening in all of that time? Rabbi Abahu, just a sage, says, this teaches that God was creating worlds and destroying them until creating these, meaning these worlds that we know now. Borei ulamot umachrivan is the Hebrew. And that is in and of itself, I think, a powerful and important statement. You can read this in a kind of more deliberate and externalized way. God is somehow, external to the world and tinkering and trying and destroying. But I think you can also read it in a much more kind of embodied way, which is what I'm really curious about exploring. Which is that God is attempting to form this life and this world, and then it doesn't work out, and that's happening multiple times. Right? So here we get a sense of the backstory of creation is that there can be multiple attempts, and they don't all work. Now, I think that this goes in a more deliberate direction, right? God is actually deliberately aborting these prior attempts of creating the world. And until now, we don't totally know why. The text continues, God said, these are pleasing to me, these are not pleasing to me. We have no more information about why some of God's attempts were pleasing and why some of them were not pleasing. All that we know is that this is the case. Some attempts to create, God decided that God wanted, and some God decided that God did not want. I want to pause here for a second and ask again if there's anything that surfaces for you so far in this idea of sort of God maybe creating the world from within God's being. And that there's this kind of flux and multiple attempts before it feels right. Feel free to respond in the chat. Okay. Just seeing some of what is emerging here in the chat so far. I agree, thank you for this comment, Susan, that the evening, the sort of image of evening is very provocative in and of itself. That it's sort of murky, non-binary. It's not the day versus the night, the light versus the darkness. But there's maybe something that's a little bit fuzzier here in creation. Yes, the question of, I feel like a lot of what this text does is, I'll stop share for 1 second here as we comment. It brings our attention to what we don't know about our world and the process of creating our world, both in terms of what we don't know about what might have happened before those attempts that were aborted, and also the plural, the idea that there's apparently worlds that currently exist, and we might realize that we don't know all of the worlds that God did decide were pleasing. Okay, I'm going to invite people to continue sharing in the chat. I want to take this in one other direction as we explore, I think part of what is at stake in this idea of God knows what it's like to have an abortion is why why are some worlds pleasing and why are some not? And is there some kind of value judgment that is being made around this choice to abort? We're going to go in two directions here. The first is that there is some value judgment, that this idea of God attempting to create and then aborting is tied to God's value judgment about whether this would be a good world. So Rabbi Pinchas supplies reasoning. A different sage comes up with reasoning that didn't exist in that first formulation. The reasoning behind Rabbi Abahu's statement is, God saw all that God had made, and behold, it was very good. These are pleasing to me, these are not pleasing to me. So this brings our attention to God is making some sort of really strategic decision, maybe some kind of morally laden decision. We don't know exactly what makes the world good here, but it seems like God is having to decide whether this particular iteration of the creation of life is good enough, and it only sort of gets to be created if it holds up to some kind of test. And I think on the one hand, you might say, okay, God is the only one who can make this kind of prediction. But on the other hand, I think if we're looking for a kind of picture of God that is more resonant with the kinds of choices that people sometimes have to make, right? Being in a situation of trying to understand and predict, will this be good or will it not be good to try to bring this life into the world? That can be so difficult and complicated, whether that's thinking through medical complexities or maybe different contextual reasons that it seems like the possibility of creation may or may not be quote unquote good. But there's another version of this text that is tied to the book of Ecclesiastes. Right? Sometimes what happens in rabbinic tradition that I find so fun to explore is you get a kernel of an idea that becomes linked to different verses in different versions of the source. So there's a different version of this story that God created worlds and aborted those attempts at creation, which is tied to the idea in Ecclesiastes that there is a time for everything. And there's a season for everything, a time for every experience under heaven, a time to be born and a time to die. And it's sort of a cryptic passage a little bit, but then we get to this line, God brings everything to pass precisely at its time, is the verse in Ecclesiastes. Everything precisely at its time. And that gives you a sort of different context for this idea, which we're going to come back to. It's the exact same idea, but now on this verse in Ecclesiastes, God brings everything to pass precisely at its time. Rabbi Tanhuma said, God created the world in its time. This teaches that they were not fit to be created beforehand. So it's not necessarily something inherently about whether this creation was good or not good. The question is just, did it feel like the right time? And we have this tradition, again, from here we see that the Holy Blessed One was building worlds, destroying them, building worlds and destroying them until God made these. And now these are pleasing. But the only thing we know about why they're pleasing is because suddenly it felt like the right time. And so I just wanna kind of close this, what I hope is kind of a thought-provoking image here, where we have this tradition that the existence of life is sort of totally wrapped in with times where life did not come into fruition. And then we have kind of at least two different versions of why that's the case. One is tied to some sort of intense evaluation about whether it will be good or not. And another is tied to just, it does or doesn't feel like the right time. And I think it's a much more kind of expansive, maybe intuitive picture of what it's like to be part of, right, to be a person, somebody who has a body that potentially has the capacity to participate in bringing life into the world. Sometimes that happens and sometimes it doesn't. And trying to know whether it is the right time or not is sort of named here as participating in divine work. I'm going to open up the chat that I just want to look at what has been coming in and invite people to also feel free to raise your hand if you want to share a comment or question on this image, what it seems to be doing, not doing, its sort of capacity, its limits to hold what feels like is part of this moment. Just going to bring out some of what is emerging here in the chat. I think part of what I find sort of astonishing about this teaching and relating to this comment here around there's a time for everything, right? It seems like in Ecclesiastes that all feels so planned. It's like there's a clear time for everything, and yet we see that actually even for God, especially for God, it seems like it didn't go according to plan. But you'd maybe think that there's some image of the divine where it's like, okay, well, God would know when it's quote unquote the right time to try. And of course it will succeed, whatever that means. And instead it's so much more of an iterative and unpredictable process here that I feel like this Midrash tradition sort of has God modeling that. That there's not control or expectation. There's things that happen and there's decisions that have to be made, either based on some sort of data or some sort of intuition that this is or isn't the right time. Yeah, if it doesn't go according to plan, that too is godly. Thank you, Yafa, for that comment. I will share, you can see this if you have this associative. I'll just share, even after God lands on the world that is the one that is apparently very good, right? You then have God kind of contingency planning, saying, I'm not going to create Abraham first, I'm going to create Adam first, because I have to save Abraham in case things go badly. I sort of need someone there to be able to intervene and set things right again, which could mean so many things, but here I feel means like even God in his creation is trying to do contingency planning and just sort of naming how much this process of pregnancy, bringing life into the world, is so unpredictable, even for God. Okay, I'm just taking in all of your comments here as well. Yeah, I think my quest and my invitation for all of us, as we are living in a moment in America right now where God can be invoked in ways that can feel so alienating and creating so much defensiveness, I think it can actually take a lot of stamina to turn towards texts and our tradition and sort of bring God into this one. I thought it was so interesting to hear Dr. Chavi Khan's how much so many of the people she's working with are people of faith. And I guess I would love for there to be more than the some kind of intuition that God will forgive me when people feel a sense of guilt. I would love for people to have access to some kind of richer sense of being held by God in a moment that feels like it's just confronting some of the unpredictability around what can happen when we participate in a world with a uterus. Thank you so much for this time together. And I'm going to save your chats and look at them in other moments. But for now, just really want to express gratitude for being here.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Aviva, for your beautiful teaching. I'm just kind of overwhelmed by the gifts and the blessings that we have tonight, hearing all these wonderful teachers and leaders. And each time I kind of feel like, oh, it's too short. I want to hear more. But I thank you all. Thank you for making this such a beautiful space.